Hi, I'm Catalina Jaime. I'm the manager of climate and conflict at the Climate Center, and I lead on anticipatory action in conflict settings. I'm delighted to share with you today some information about why it is important to understand risk for anticipatory action. In this video, you will look at these four elements: how to start the risk analysis, how to select hazards and assess past impacts of disasters, to identify who and what is exposed by these hazards, and identify the key vulnerability indicators that could be used in your anticipatory action system. The guiding questions that we have for this section and that you can find in the Anticipatory Action of Forecast-Based Financing Manual are these. What hazards should be considered for the early action protocol development? What are the disaster risk and the disaster impacts that could be addressed by anticipatory action? And what are the root causes of those disaster risk and impacts? We need to understand what is the vulnerability and exposure that is part of our process. What vulnerability and exposure indicators should be prioritized as part of our trigger development and as well as the selection of actions. To start, I want to take you through some examples to really understand what are the different risk factors that we need to consider in the anticipatory action system. So we're going to basically do an exercise to try to understand risk. This example actually was created by UNDRR, and it is a very simple and straightforward to explain what exposure, vulnerability, disaster risks mean. So this is the situation. So imagine that you are in your laptop, and on the top of your laptop there is a shelf where there is a glass of water that is a little bit unstable. Then you move out of your laptop, and this is the risk situation that we are facing. In this case, the hazard is the glass that is on the top of the shelf. It is an unstable glass of water, and in this case is the hazard that might impact your laptop. In the case of anticipatory action, the hazard will correspond to the different natural hazards, anthropogenic hazards that might impact communities, assets, livelihoods, and all the different exposed elements. So the type of hazards that we are included in anticipatory actions are hydrometeorological hazards like floods and heat waves and cyclones, biological hazards like COVID, technological hazards could be also potentially included, and more we're discussing the opportunities to explore anthropogenic hazards such as conflict. Now let's look at what is exposure. The position of the laptop in this case represents the exposure. And exposure in this example is determined by the position of the laptop right under the shelf. Our laptop is situated in a hazard-prone area. In the context of anticipatory action, exposure is really related to the people, the infrastructure, the livelihoods, the services, and other elements that are susceptible to be impacted by a hazard because they are in that particular location. So this means basically that are all these different elements that are in a hazard-prone area. Now, vulnerability. The characteristics of the laptop in this case represents its vulnerability. The laptop is vulnerable to water falling from the glass because it's an electronic device that can be heavily damaged by water. If we had a plastic ball, for example, on the table instead of a laptop, vulnerability levels will be much lower or even non-existent. In the case of anticipatory action, vulnerability are the characteristics of all these different exposed elements, in this case, people or livelihoods or infrastructure or services, are those characteristics that make them susceptible to be impacted by a hazard. Now, what is disaster risk? Is basically that combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. In some occasions, we can use in the equation coping capacities, but for this example, we're going to use only hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. These three elements combined is what generates a risk of disaster. If the glass full of water falls from the shelf, it is likely to spill water on the laptop and in consequence affect the functioning of the laptop, which is very sensitive to water being an electronic device. In our context of anticipatory action, the disaster risk is that possibility or likelihood that either a community or a particular infrastructure or a particular livelihood could be impacted, could be affected, could suffer because is exposed a particular hazard like a flood or a heat wave or others. Now, what is disaster impact? Disaster impact is basically the materialization of disaster risk. It is basically when a risk is materialized and transformed into an actual disaster. Now, we're going to look into the different steps that we recommend when you are setting up an anticipatory action system. So this element of understanding risk is very important for the definition of your triggers, your system that will allow you to define when and where you need to act in advance of a disaster, but also it is very essential to define what are the actions that need to be implemented. So we start with the risk analysis process. So one of the key things that we start from the beginning is to identify what are the key actors with access to information about historical disaster impacts and risk information. We can conduct as well literature reviews, we can look into databases of past events. The most important part of these steps is that we need to understand the past. We need to understand what have been the most severe disaster events, what were the hazards that induced those disaster events, why did they happen, who was affected. It is like an in-depth forensic investigation of disasters. I would recommend you to look into the impact-based forecasting guide that is in the Anticipation Hub website because it has like a really good examples and ideas of what is this process of understanding risk, in addition, of course, of the anticipatory action of forecast-based financing manual. In this case, in the impact-based forecasting guide, you will find these type of tables that really shows you clearly that relationship between the hazard, the impact, where could be those data repositories, where you will be able to find the information that can help you to understand what is the picture of risk in a particular context and to understand the history of disaster past events. So in this case, for particular type of events, you could consult the MDAT dataset or this inventory. Prevention Web has as well a lot of information, but most importantly, at national level, there are a lot of data repositories of information that could be very useful. Of course, all these in addition to the different process of talking to key people that can inform these disaster past events. One of the results of all these analyses is the selection of the hazard and the assessment of the past impacts. So once you have all your information from step one, in step two, what you need to do is to define what could be the priority hazard that you would tackle in your anticipatory action system to develop your early action protocol. Of course, this step is really intertwined to the analysis of forecast information because you will select the hazard, of course, in view that there is a possibility to forecast that particular hazard. So what you will do is to prioritize the hazard for your early action protocol. It could be either a flood, it could be a cyclone, heat waves, and nowadays we're expanding to other hazards, of course, including biological hazards like cholera and others. And you will also create a list of priority disaster impacts, because you need to understand what exactly makes sense to be reduced with an anticipatory action system. It will be very difficult to just try to reduce all the risk and with an anticipatory action system. Therefore, it is very important that you prioritize and think what really makes sense for us to reduce in our anticipatory action system. So when you look into the prioritization of your impact, we recommend you to use, for example, this type of tables. So you look at your particular hazard, like the primary hazard that induced the disaster. Then you look at the cascading hazards. In this case, heavy rainfall can lead to landslides or mudslides or flooding, different type of flooding. And then you look into what are the primary impacts. What was the immediate impact that hazard like produce? But it is also important to look into the secondary impacts, because maybe you might be interested to focus on reducing those secondary impacts, or maybe you decide to really focus on one of the particular primary impacts. That analysis is very important to be done for all the different hazards that you have prioritized. Now, the third step is to identify who and what is exposed. Because of course, when there is a disaster, we need to understand who was affected, like exactly at what extent and in which given location. So in this example, for instance, you can see that we are looking at the different potential exposed elements. It could be a person, it could be a particular building, it could be particular materials or assets or services. So it is important to identify that, because it is the basis to identify the key indicators that could be included into the trigger model, and as well for the selection of early actions. This is a couple of examples of like what does it really mean exposure. So in this case, if a prioritized impact of floods is the mortality of children under 5 due to waterborne diseases, then the exposed element will be the population of children under 5. In this case, if the most frequently recurring and largest impact due to tropical storm is the damage of houses built in light materials, then the exposed element will be houses built in light materials. And then the third example, if the prioritized impact due to cold waves is the mortality of alpacas, then the exposed element will be the alpaca population. Now, we go into the identification of the key vulnerability indicators. So once we understand clearly what our priority impacts, we know exactly who or what was actually impacted and what are our priority exposure elements, then we need to understand what are those vulnerability indicators in the process. So for this, we need to look at the different types of vulnerability. And we recommend you to observe the physical vulnerability, economic vulnerability, social vulnerability, and environmental vulnerability, because all these different elements are at the end the root causes of disasters. And to be able to set up an anticipatory action system that truly is able to reduce particular impacts, you need to understand very clearly what are all these root causes of disasters. For example, you could identify the case of physical vulnerability. It could be the materials, how buildings are built, like the type of materials that are used. In terms of economic vulnerability, we can identify access to basic services, of course, like poverty. In social vulnerability, we would like to understand how different social groups are affected. Maybe people living with disabilities have suffered in particular ways when there was a particular disaster. We can look, for instance, at people affected by conflict, refugees, IDPs, children, elderly people that might be very affected to particular hazards like heat waves. But also it's important to look at environmental vulnerability. I mean, what is the status of environmental degradation in a particular area, the resource scarcity, or the overuse of land, are all of them like really important elements that we need to understand to be able to set up an anticipatory action system that is fit for purpose and that truly address disaster risks. Now, I'm going to take you to an example of like what that doesn't really mean to do all this process to get the key indicators that we need for our system. So this is the example of the mortality of children under 5 due to waterborne diseases induced by floods. So first we do an analysis. What are the root causes? What have produced or induced that particular disaster impact? And here just simple ideas. Of course, in each context it will be different, but it might be the case that it is due because there are really unsafe hygiene practice, or there is like very high rates of malnutrition. There are potentially depletion of water resources because of overconsumption or because many other reasons. Maybe the health systems are very fragile due to conflict. So the combination of all these elements had made the disaster impact more likely. Now the question is, how do we understand all these different indicators to define what are the vulnerability indicators that we will include into our anticipatory action system? And here are potential vulnerability indicators that you might find in particular contexts. You potentially get a database of access to water at municipal level, and you can have the whole picture of the country, and you will know which are the areas that have less or more access to water. You could also have data sets of malnutrition rates at very lower administrative levels. You can have information of like health centers, where they are located, what are the services that they produce, what is the type of work that they are doing. So when you combine all the different indicators and you monitor them, that could be one of the key elements for your triggering system in combination with a forecast information. So these are some like key questions that we recommend you to always look at when you are starting your system. So let's look at really the risk drivers of disaster impacts. Like, well, what is the reason why the disaster is happening? What are all these underlying roots of impacts? And I think more and more is important to look at the compound effects of risk. We don't want to look at the particular risk in an isolated way, but we really want to understand much better the interconnections. We want you to look at what are the vulnerability indicators that are related to the identified disaster impacts and exposed elements, and which vulnerability indicators can actually be used for the trigger model. And for this, it's really important to assess the quality of those indicators. Maybe they are like really bad, so maybe it's not really worth it even to use them. Another element is that, are they really covering the entire region or country of our focus? Because if they are not at the scale, maybe they are not really useful for us. And the other element is that, are all these data sets that are showing us the indicators, are they really updated with the frequency that is needed? The other element is which vulnerability indicators are redundant, and which indicators provide new information. So this is like a really iterative process in which you will find over time during the entire design of your early action protocols or contingency plans. You will have more and more information, so it's really important to adapt your system to this. So I hope with this you have a very good sense of like why it is important to understand risk in the context of anticipatory action, why it's really important to understand the root causes of disasters, and why it is important to really prioritize what impacts really make sense to be reduced with anticipatory action. Because remember, with anticipatory action, we are focusing on managing the residual risk. We need to be very realistic of what we could do in the window of opportunity between a forecast and the disaster. Thank you.